You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about.
Shit, Pelosi right here. Fucking communists.
Fucking.
You will not replace us.
If we are fortunate enough to win back the House and/or the Senate, that's when civility can start again.
So why is politics so toxic right now? Why is there so much vitriol and fear-mongering? Well, I think I might have an answer to that. In an episode of the Weekly Comment, I talked about how I believe that growing executive power is a big motivating factor behind the political toxicity we are facing. And although I still think that's a big part of it, I've had time to think about it since then, and I think I have a more refined explanation of the problem as it is. However, in order to explain it thoroughly enough, I'm going to need to split this up into its constituent parts. Before I explain the how and the why, I need to explain the what. So, what exactly is the political toxicity cycle? The cycle has 3 points. At one point there is Congress, at another point there is the presidency, and at a third point there is the voting public. A president is elected, and they have campaign promises and policy goals they want to implement. The most ideal situation would be to have their political faction have an overwhelming control of Congress. But since this doesn't usually happen, whatever control is there is slim enough for the opposition party to disrupt the president's goals. Congress is usually the slowest branch of government to act, and the factions inside it are constantly trying to undermine or undercut the other. This results in Congress not being able to push through legislation that lines up with the president's ambitions. Since the president can't get what they want done through Congress, they try to act without it. Now, the legality and constitutionality of these different actions vary, but regardless, they are all done without the approval of Congress. These actions are then interpreted by a part of the voting public as being hostile towards them, their goals, or their interests, which results in that portion of the public rallying and organizing against the political faction of the current president. If it's an off-election year, they lobby the opposition party to do anything they can to undermine the president, and if it's an election year, they rally around more extreme candidates who will do anything to undermine the president. Both situations result in Congress getting even less done. And since they get less done, the president has to act on his own more, and because the president acts on his own more, the public gets angry, which means they have to rally around candidates again, and the cycle continues. A big reason this cycle exists is because the government isn't functioning as it was intended. Let's start with Congress. The framers intended Congress to be the most powerful branch of government. This is easily seen when looking at the US Constitution and noticing that not only Congress is the first branch of government covered in the document, but that it is the longest section of the Constitution, with the greatest number of expressed powers. However, Congress was also designed to be the slowest acting part of government. Considering that you need at least a majority of people in each chamber to support a bill, this would make Congress the most likely branch to be dysfunctional, and this was by design. Not only was the dysfunctional nature of Congress designed into the Constitution itself, there were additional dysfunctionalities that they intended to occur. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison argued that we didn't need to fear the rise of factionalism, in fact that we should embrace it. Because as factions rose, they would constantly try to undercut each other, therefore tyrannical government would be far less likely because no political faction could ever get everything at once. James Madison was correct in his vision that the factions in Congress would work hard to undermine each other, but he didn't predict that it would be just two factions. He saw political coalitions being made to pass and prevent legislation from other groups or factions. What actually ended up happening is that the two sustainable political factions undermine one another through the use of parliamentary procedure and media manipulation rather than political alliances. Another problem the framers of the Constitution didn't see coming for some reason was the existence of interbranch political factions. The framers probably anticipated that there would be multiple factions within each branch of government, and each branch would have its own separate set of factions. Instead, we got factions that transcend the branches of government. I think these assumptions came from the framers' understanding of British politics. For a long time, British politics was a struggle between factions that believed either the king or parliament should have more power in government. I think the framers believed that America's political evolution would start at or near this point, where the first political struggle would be over which branch of government would have more power in politics. Instead, we got a system where the fight was between different factions factions who tried to control the entirety of government. And in all honesty, we shouldn't be surprised by this. The fight over which branch would be the most dominant in the government was settled before there even was a British government. This was decided by the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution 100 years earlier. Since that point, the struggle within the English and then later British governments was between factions trying to control Parliament, and therefore have influence over the Crown. The framers either didn't recognize this political development within the British government, or they thought that America's political evolution would start a stage or two back from where they were separating. So those are the structural problems with Congress. But as we see, there's more than just that. There's also the presidency, in which was imagined to be an administrator as such. You know, he would enforce the laws passed by Congress and then command the military during times of war. However, these structural problems lead to a twofold issue. As elections became more democratic, it became more advantageous for presidential candidates to make policy promises to voters. Because of this, the president became more politically accountable to voters, so that they have a motive for pursuing the implementation of their policies by any means necessary. The other problem that emerged was, of course, interbranch political factions. This becomes an issue when the president does something that is unconstitutional, illegal, or just politically divisive. And since he has people in Congress willing to defend him in anything he does, he will never face the consequences from the opposition party. This ultimately makes the system of checks and balance in the government irrelevant. This problem then falls into the laps of the voting public. Those who elected the president get mad when their guys don't do whatever is necessary to implement the president's goals or defend him from the opposition. And those who voted against the president get angry when the president implements policies they don't like, or when the opposition doesn't do whatever it takes to stop the implementation of those policies. And anger and fear, sometimes natural and sometimes manufactured by media, they go and do whatever they see as necessary to prevent the world-ending evils they believe will occur if the president isn't stopped or helped. So if this is how the cycle works, how did it come to existence in the first place? So part of the problem, as discussed in the previous section, is structural. However, the part about the president taking more and more power for themselves is not a structural problem, but rather a political one. The power of the presidency has been growing since the establishment of the Republic. However, the rate of its growth has varied over the years. Back in the 18th and 19th century, the presidency mostly grew during times of war. The American Civil War was probably the first major expansion of power for the executive branch. But the remainder of the century was a period of which the president took a step back from federal power. What changed everything was the Progressive Era and the Great Depression. The Progressive Era, lasting roughly from 1900 to 1920, saw a series of presidents and Congresses vastly expand federal power. The presidents, beginning with Theodore Roosevelt, started to expand executive power through the use of executive orders. George Washington issued a total of 8 executive orders during his presidency. Before Theodore Roosevelt, Ulysses S. Grant held the record for the most executive orders, issuing 217 in 8 years. And prior to Theodore Roosevelt, a total of 1,262 executive orders had been issued. Well, how many did Teddy issue? 1,081. He nearly doubled the number of executive orders ever issued in his 8 years in office. And these orders were far more expansive than what George Washington had ever issued, which included giving his secretaries permission to buy stamps on behalf of the president. This pattern continued under William Howard Taft. Even though he only issued 724 during his time in office, it should be remembered that he only served 1 term, meaning that he issued more executive orders in a single term than Teddy did. This would continue under Taft's successor Woodrow Wilson, who issued 1,803. The Progressive Era saw the federal government get involved in areas of individual life and the economy that the framers of the Constitution never imagined it would. The 1913 Federal Revenue Act established a system for legal recognition of marriage at the federal level. Before then, the only federal law dealing with marriage was the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, which is mostly just a law targeting the Mormons out in Utah. The federal government passed the first constitutional income tax laws, as well as federal prohibition on alcohol, and the federal government regulating the quality of food in private transactions. They also passed laws about who an employer was allowed to hire, how long those employees were allowed to work, and how much they were allowed to be paid. On top of that, the US military became far more active outside the borders of the United States, and doing so without congressional approval. The growth of federal power slowed down during the 1920s, but picked back up again during the Great Depression. First with the policies of Herbert Hoover, and then put into overdrive under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This period saw the creation of numerous federal agencies, which regulate nearly every facet of an individual's life. And the democratically controlled Congress was willing to give these kinds of powers to the executive branch because their guy was in office. Throughout the Cold War, we saw Congress give over more and more power to the executive branch through the process of rules making. What happens is that Congress passes a law saying that they want a certain type of new regulation. Members of Congress don't specify exactly what they want in a regulation bill. What happens is that a process is started by a committee of bureaucrats writing and proposing the minute details of regulations. These proposals go through a number of public hearings until the appropriate body within a federal agency is allowed to vote on the proposals. This contributes to the power of the presidency because it's the president that either appoints the individuals on the rules making and approving bodies, or appoints the people who appoint them. So the first 3/4 or so of the 20th century saw a democratically controlled Congress voluntarily giving power over to democratic presidents. Okay, so we've seen the structural causes of the cycle and the historical mechanisms that put it into place in the first place. But it didn't really get started until the 1990s, so why did it happen then? So in the first section we saw how the cycle works, and in the second section we saw how another part of the cycle was put into place. But how did it start? To understand this, I think we need to look at the political makeup of Congress throughout the 20th century. The Republicans were pretty dominant in Congress for the first 30 years, with an 8-year intermission in both the House and Senate corresponding to the rise and fall of Woodrow Wilson. But starting in 1931, the House of Representatives was absolutely dominated by the Democrats, consisting of 64 years of near uninterrupted control. The Democrats' monopoly on Senate wasn't nearly as powerful as it was on the House, but between 1933 and 1981, they only had 2 brief interruptions in power, which happened to be at the same times as those in the House. Now let's think about this for a minute. Congress was a virtual one-party branch of government for most of the 20th century. Whenever the president was a Democrat, Congress happily handed over power to it because it was their guy. And whenever it wasn't a Democrat, they had the numbers to take the president to task on whatever they wanted to do. So basically, there is nothing the federal government could do for most of the 20th century that the Democrats didn't have a say in. But then the 1990s came, and in 1994 the Republicans won control of Congress for the first time in 64 years. And since then, they have only lost control of the House for a total of 4 years, and the Senate for a total of 10. Most millennials wouldn't appreciate how big of a change this was. For people who are ages 30 and younger, Republicans controlling Congress more often than not is the norm. But for baby boomers and Gen Xers, this is a radical change. Put yourselves in the shoes of a young Republican politician in the mid-90s. The Democrats could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, for most of the century. Unless they wanted to do something about civil rights, they didn't need to talk to the Republicans at all. Imagine yourself being excluded from the decision-making process for the better part of a century. What would you do once you finally held the reins of power? If you were an activist, then you would hope that the party would finally implement some of the policies you were thinking. Tax cuts, spending cuts, maybe a few social issues. Well, that's not what really happened, at least not in the way Republican activists wanted. Since that time, Congressional Republicans have been more concerned with retaining control of Congress instead of actually pushing through any major reforms they've had in mind. They've been more concerned with preventing the Democrats from pushing through their agenda than pushing through their own. Now let's put ourselves in the shoes of Democrats at this time. You've held control of Congress and essentially the country for as long as most people have been alive. So how dare these newcomers tell you that you can't get whatever you want whenever you want? Since the '94 elections, Republicans have been a nervous wreck, constantly in fear of losing control of Congress. And the Democrats have gone insane from losing what they assumed was their birthright to control the United States. This is not a recipe for political civility. When a Democrat is in the White House, the Democratic Party lets them do whatever they want, and use parliamentary procedures to block any attempts by Republicans to hold them accountable. And when a Republican is in the White House, the Republicans put more effort into protecting their guy than actually pushing through their policy goals. The highly divisive Congress results in the president doing more and more on their own. This feeds into the political toxicity cycle and what I like to call the era of bad feelings. Okay then, so why was the executive branch allowed to gain this much power in the first place? Why would we let this happen if it was going to create such a toxic hotbed of political discourse? Before the 20th century, we never really saw the executive branch grow so dramatically outside of a time of war. So why did the 20th century suddenly see vast expanses of executive power without having anyone to fight? Well, I would argue that this is the fault of the voters themselves. The latter half of the 19th century was a period of rapid change. New technology impacted the economy, and the new economic realities impacted the social norms of America and the rest of the world. Enclosure eliminated the ability of people to make a living off the public grazing land. Technological development then created a demand for labor that these newly displaced persons could fill. But these new jobs required people to relocate to cities that did not have the infrastructure to handle the influx. This resulted in both newly arriving immigrants and people from the rural areas competing for physical space in the cities. The overcrowded cities are dirty, with people living in close proximity, with a lack of running water and indoor plumbing for many older areas of those cities. On top of this, the jobs created by new technology are culturally unfamiliar, especially when it comes to working conditions and work hours. In the old economy, if someone got sick, they could take time off because they were probably working for their own family or a close neighbor who knew them more personally and were willing to give them this time off without letting them go economically destitute. But these new jobs had people working for complete strangers, and there was a good chance you would never actually meet the person who was signing your paycheck every month. This radical change in the economy resulted in radical demands from the population, and the deliberately slow-moving Congress was not sufficient to meet these demands, which resulted in more people demanding the president to take action. So ultimately, the political toxicity is not caused by social media, universities, or even old media. It's our fault. We did it. We are the reason the political system is so toxic. And our willingness to get what we want, despite the rules, is something that political parties and different factions and candidates and politicians are willing to use and exploit. So where do we go from here? The way out of this problem, as I see it, is twofold. One, are we willing to hold our own political parties accountable? And two, are we willing to radically rethink how our government works or what it does? Holding our own parties, and then those parties holding presidents from within their own ranks accountable, is a lot easier said than done. How do we hold our own parties accountable? Well, part of the problem is campaign finance laws. Laws restricting how much money individuals are allowed to contribute to campaigns have ensured a 90% re-election rate for incumbents. This means that it's really hard for an outsider to compete in elections, which makes it really hard to challenge sitting officials. And of course, there is the ever-present issue of gerrymandering. On top of this, the currently existing toxicity makes it hard to break ranks and vote against your own party. Even if you vote against your own party in hopes of teaching them a lesson about holding the executive branch accountable, there is no guarantee that the people you've allowed to gain power by doing this are going to return the favor. If one party decides to do this, then that politically weakens them, which will likely result in their opponents taking control after the next election. There's no incentive for being the first to do this. The other big problem we have to think about are what our expectations of our government are. We've been asking it to do things for the last century that it is just not designed to do. Our Constitution does not allow for quick changing policies and laws. Because of what we've been asking of our government, we need to come to a new consensus. We need to have a conversation as a country about what do we expect of our government. Do we radically change it so it's capable of doing the things we're asking of it, or do we change our expectations of government and not ask it to do the things that we've been wanting it to do? Until we come to answers on those two questions, nothing is going to get better. If you're curious about digging into more of the ideas and concepts I went into in this video, I have in the description of this video a list of books you can go through, and of course with some of those books there are Amazon affiliate links that you can buy those books or anything else through, which will support the channel if you do so. You can also support this channel by going to patreon.com/casualhistorian. There you can become a patron at multiple different levels, and at different levels you get different perks and rewards, such as getting your name in the end credits of videos, seeing new videos early, as well as getting some other special perks. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.